Hi everyone and welcome to this new video in which I continue and finish, finally, the Windows Privilege Escalation series. Now in this last video, I want to give you two different things, a cheat sheet and a methodology. So the first thing we will see in this video is a cheat sheet, and you can find the file in the GitHub repository. Here I have the org file, windowsprivesc.cheatsheet.org, and this cheat sheet contains all the commands that we covered in the series divided by the area of interest. For example, basic commands, file system, user privileges and permission, file transfers, reverse shell, the same personate privilege exploitation, on-cross compilation, DLL hijacking, UAC bypass, AMC bypass. So the idea here is that I went through all the different videos and all the different files that I've written for the course. I extracted all the commands and I've put it and organized into this cheat sheet. So I hope it is useful. So that's the idea, it is divided into 17 different sections. Now, would I say that this covers 100% everything that you need on Windows? Clearly not. I'm not gonna make that statement because this is introductory Privesc. Of course, I've tried to explain things in depth, but this is just to introduce yourself to Windows Privilege Escalation. If you want to become an expert on it, then you need to study more, and maybe in the future I'm gonna make more content more in depth. For now, with this knowledge though, you should be fine for an OSCP-like level certification. If you're interested in OSCP and you have this knowledge, then you are good to go, because typically machines require one of these techniques. But of course, if you want to become, for example, a security researcher in the context of Windows, this is clearly not enough. However, it is a good start and it lays a very solid foundation, which was my objective after all. So the first thing is a cheat sheet, and the second thing is a methodology. Because while the cheat sheet is useful because it contains all the commands, so that we don't have to go look them up online, ask some ChatGPT or something like that to get them, we just have them in the cheat sheet. With the methodology, it's a little bit different, it's a different file, and essentially it contains a bunch of strategies for how to approach Windows Privilege Escalation. So I will also share this, it will also be present in the GitHub repository, link in the description, and I will discuss how I will go through it. So I hope this last one is enjoyable and useful as the others. If it was, leave some feedback in the comment, subscribe to the channel, share this video and this series with like-minded people to help me grow here on YouTube, and enjoy the video. So let's get started with the cheat sheet first. So as I said, it was divided in 17 sections, and for each section I tried also to put references to the video where I show and discuss those commands, and also to the material that I developed that is currently present in the GitHub repository. So GitHub Leonardo in 95 YouTube-N, which stands for YouTube English essentially. So for example, in this case, the first section is the basic. This is like super basic system enumeration, like the operating system, the version, the architecture, who is the user, environmental variables, the path, where are executables, some help with the documentation, very, very simple commands. Then we move on to the file system. And for example, here we have the history, PowerShell history. We have, for example, the registry hives because they are specific files in the file system. We have, for example, where the history file is saved, as I was saying. And also we have the commands to search file recursively. And this is actually extremely useful, as we will see in the methodology section, because one of the first things you want to do on a system is explore the file system. Understand what kind of files are saved, with what kind of extensions, what kind of programs, and so like doing this kind of recursive searches is really, really useful. So that's the idea. The file system is an important aspect of privilege escalation. Then we find commands relative to the permission system in Windows. So to list out the groups I belong to, the user belongs to list out the current privileges, the accounts in the system, to list out the user detail, so net user, and then you put the username, to get the list of local users of local groups, to get the members from a local group, permissions on a file, and to enumerate the SIDs, which belong to the Windows permission system. So just a bunch of useful commands to move around permissions, essentially. Then we find the commands for file transfers. So these are using two main utilities, which is the cert util and the invoke web request. And I've discussed a lot about them. So here I put the link in the where I use them essentially. Then commands for reverse shells. So here I put with netcat, with the invoke PowerShell TCP PowerShell command, with msvenom, and also with the custom PowerShell that I showcase during the course, and also how to use it essentially. So these are useful things to have. Then with the say impersonate privilege, so how to exploit this specific privilege, we have the sprint puffer and the god potato. Of course, many different exploits work in this, but for example, for my experience, these one are good enough. If they don't work, maybe you can search further, but they should work. Then we have the say backup privilege. So this privilege allows us to perform a copy of the SAM and system file which contain the NTLM hashes of the users, so they can be used in the context of Windows to either crack the hashes to obtain the password or to perform pass the hash techniques, which we will see in the next series, which is going to be regarding Active Directory. Now at that point it's going to be fun, but for now, for privilege escalation itself, we just know how to copy SAM and system. Clearly, Active Directory and Windows Privilege Escalation, they are related with each other. That is, some of the things we did not discuss in this series, we will discuss in the Active Directory exploitation. And then if you want to have the full Windows experience, you can follow both courses to get the privilege escalation on a single machine and all the exploitation of network protocols of the Kerberos system and stuff like that in the privilege escalation. Because one of the techniques that you do in Active Directory is also known as pass the hash, where you do not have to crack the NTLM hash to actually use it. You can just pass it along. So that's the idea. Then continuing, we have the commands for performing cross compilations using the MinGW compiler. So here it's a very useful tool to program in Linux and execute in Windows. Now, I did not code too much using the Win32 APIs. However, that could be a good content for the future, just to bring more content on, okay, how do I use these APIs? How do I craft either malicious software, or how do I detect malicious software if it's running on my system? And of course, this has to do with what the Win32 APIs do essentially. So that's a really cool thing. In the series, we just introduced the idea. We show some example, for example, how to compile a service. So we show how to do that. And in the future, maybe I can cover more. So with respect to services, we talk a lot because they represent a very significant attack surface in the context of Windows Privilege Escalation. So all the commands, for example, to get a service, to enumerate services, to stop, start, restart service. So all the control that has to do with a service with the tool sc.exe, very, very useful. Then we have change the configuration, the permission, extract the security descriptor, get the executable path for the process, create a new process, delete a service. So in this case, it's create a new service starting from an executable that was obtained through cross-compilation. So this topic, of course, they interact with each other. Then, for example, we have list out the DLLs of a given service, this more in the context of DLL hijacking. And also in one of the latest video, I show how to modify the image path using the registry. So a different thing, but still related to services. Sometimes you attack a service not directly through the service configuration, but going through the registry. So that's the idea. And then how to enumerate services with WinPass. So a little bit about enumeration. So services, really huge attack surface. Here I have all the content you can find. I'm not gonna put all these links in the description, but the idea is that you just get the link to the cheat sheet and you will find everything within it. So that's the idea. Then a really important part is processes and programs. So get the list of running processes and get the install application, 32-bit and 64-bit. We will talk why this is important in the methodology section. Then, of course, DLL hijacking, as I was saying. Here I put the search order. Here I put a little example of a malicious library that you can just introduce in the search order to hijack execution. In this first example, we know that the program uses the function add numbers. if we don't have this knowledge, if we don't know what are the functions that are used by the program, we can just introduce a DLL main, which is going to execute regardless if we are called or not. So anytime we are loaded by a program, this is the entry point of the DLL, which always executes. So it's a much stronger way to do this kind of technique. Then, of course, we talk about the registry. So we talk about different paths of the registry. So we talk about the always install elevated configuration, which allows to, of course, elevate privileges, the service image path, which I also mentioned in the service, the load up init DLLs, and the up init DLLs, which allow to perform DLL hijacking, the run and the win logon registry path, which instead can be used for persistence. So once you have an initial code execution, by using those kind of method, you can always be assured that every time the system is like someone logs in, it's going to execute the payload. Then we have the WAC bypass. So here I put a little recap of the different WAC levels and how to bypass the different levels. So how to enumerate the current WAC configuration and how to bypass the different levels depending on the situation. Of course, for most of the levels, here I'm assuming that always install elevated is enabled. If this is not, you can use, for example, DLL hijacking as a different technique, but in general, this is like the harder part of UAC. If you have level 0 or level 5, there are way easier methods to bypass UAC. So that's the idea. Then I put a little bit about Windows hashes, so the different hashes, the different configuration, for example, the usage of responder to steal the net NTLM hash, so this can be useful, how to crack them, so how to download the raw keyword list, and how to crack the different types of hashes. Then the Windows Vault with the credential, with the logon credential, to list out all store credential, to list out all the entries in the vault. Schedule task, how to enumerate them, how to create them essentially. So in this case, it's just enumeration. Then I have enumeration scripts. Here I put 4 different enumeration scripts, which is WinPass, PowerUp, Previous Check, and Beirut. So different projects, you can choose the one you prefer. And finally, two simple ways to do AMSI bypass. So essentially, this is it for the cheat sheet. It included all the commands that we saw in the series. If you think some more commands should be added, feel free to do a pull request in the GitHub repository. When I have time, I will check it out. So thank you very much for your contribution. So that's the idea for the cheat sheet. Now in the second part of this video, instead, I want to discuss a very basic but solid methodology that you can use to perform Privesc in the context of Windows. Say, for example, you are doing on OSCP. Typically in OSCP, you have the Active Directory part, which is 3 Windows machines, and also 3 independent machines. And these 3 independent can either be Windows or Linux. For example, in my exam, it was 1 Linux and 2 Windows. So I had to do 2 Windows Privilege Escalation. So in this methodology, we will go through the thinking process behind it all. And before starting to discuss the methodology itself, I just want to say, it's gonna be a little bit abstract, because if it weren't, I would not be able to apply it to every context. So the idea is that I don't know the specific Windows machine that you will do. However, this is a general approach on how to think about it. So let's get started. Now, what's the first thing you should do? Well, the idea is that you are an outside machine, you are an attacker machine, you want to get inside a target machine. Now, in this simplified CTF exams context, the idea is that you can abstract away the outside world. So it's just you and the target, and there is a communication link between you and the target. Now, this is extremely simplified, but it's a good thing for us, because it means that everything you need to exploit the target is within the target. Now, this thing, when you do bug bounty, when you do penetration tests, when you are in the real world, this thing is no longer true. However, for this kind of training activities, CTFs, like certification, this is true. So never forget about this. There is a solution and everything you need is within your target. You just need to see it, which is a crazy amount of information already that we have. So that's the idea. So how do we interact with the target? Well, the idea is that there are going to be services, and each service will expose a certain protocol with a certain, a bunch of messages that they send back and forth. So the first thing you want to do is scan for services. Try to really understand what are each service and if they are vulnerable, essentially, because to get an initial foothold into the machine, you will have to exploit one of those services. So the hardest part initially is to understand what is the foothold. So how do you find the service to exploit for the foothold? Now, in this case, this is actually not treated by the course itself, right? Because we're doing privilege escalation. We are assuming we already have some code in the system and we want to elevate our privileges. However, before getting there, in a real situation, even in a certification scenario, let's say, to get there, you need to exploit a service. Now, we will cover this more in the Active Directory series, but essentially, you have web services and non-web services. Now, why do I separate them? I separate them because web technology is very structured and specific. So anytime you find a service, ask yourself this first. Is it a web service or is it something else? If it is a web service, then you want to enumerate for files and directories, you want to enumerate for virtual host, you want to enumerate for DNS, maybe if there are special domain names and things of the sort. You want to enumerate the technology stack used by the web services and check for known CVEs. This often happens in entry-level certification. They want to test your ability to search for known vulnerabilities. So, for example, you do a web request, the server contains the server banner, the response of the server contains the server banner, and you search if there are vulnerabilities on that particular version of PHP, Tomcat.NET, Microsoft SQL, stuff like that. And then, if you don't find anything, you search for custom vulnerabilities. So, in simple certifications such as the OSCP, I always suggest first you enumerate, so try to understand really what is going on, which means understand all the files of the application, understand the technology it is written in. Is it a PHP application or is it a Java based on Tomcat application, or is it, for example, a C#.NET based application? So you want to understand the technological stack before even understanding the vulnerabilities. So that's your first step. Then, once you know the technological stuff, the technological stack, you want to search for known CVs. So enumerate basic web servers, enumerate PHP version or Tomcat version, the version of the web server that is serving the application. Enumerate if there are specific frameworks. For example, if there is a Ruby on Rails framework, enumerate the version and try to search for known CVs. Anything that is publicly available, anything that is already vulnerable. Then, if you find it, it doesn't mean that it's the way. It could also be a rabbit hole, so this is really careful to understand. If you find a CV that matches your technological stack, it's not game over, it's just a start. It's like, okay, let's actually try to exploit it. So find vulnerabilities with easy proof of concept, with proof of concepts that are either already implemented or can be easily implemented. So maybe there is a request that is not authenticated, maybe there is an RC in a parameter of a particular endpoint. Find something that is easy to check. Do not go into too complex initially. Try to have a mentality where first you're doing easy things, and as the easy things don't work out, they get more complex and complex. So do not go immediately for the more complex and abstract and like obscure stuff and exploit. Start with the easy ones. If they don't work, then go for the more complex one. And if you don't find anything, then probably it means that you have to do some custom web exploitation. And of course, for this, you should watch the web exploitation series. In that series, we analyze single web vulnerabilities. We don't put them together in like a full penetration test on web application. However, we do analyze the most important one that you will find in the context of, for example, OSCP. So the single vulnerabilities like file upload vulnerabilities, like injection vulnerabilities, like cross-site scripting, like things of the sort. So that's the idea. Also in that series, we discuss about how to enumerate files, how to enumerate virtualhost, how to do DNS zone transfer attacks, and things of the sort. So for web services, there are like specific paths to go. understand the application, understand the technological stack, understand the virtual host, so enumerate everything you can enumerate, check for known vulnerabilities. If there are none, maybe you must find a custom vulnerability in the specific way that service is implemented. If you have a non-web service, essentially the idea still stands. However, in this case, you also have to understand the specific entry points of that service and how to interact with that service. So the main idea is that web services have a very common pattern of interaction. Typically, you go with a browser. That's it. Other non-web services could be a little bit harder. Maybe you require specific clients, SMB clients, LDAP clients, depending on the service. But the idea is that enumerate the entry points and check for common misconfiguration, such as, for example, oh look, I have an SMB share that is open to the public. In this case, this is a vulnerability because it allows non-authenticated user to access the data in that specific share. So do not go too complex. Initially, always check for common misconfiguration, then check for known CVEs, and finally check for custom vulnerabilities. But in this context, in the non-web context, it's even harder to find a certification, a entry-level certification, for example, that requires custom vulnerabilities on non-web services. This is mostly done for research. Like if you want to do security research, then of course you also look for custom vulnerabilities in the implementation of specific non-web services such as LDAP, SMB, and things of the sort. The Kerberos implementation, like there are a lot of things that could be vulnerable. But initially, and for certification context, just try to study well the service. And in the Active Directory series, in the future series, we will analyze a bunch of these services, the most common one, a bunch of misconfiguration, and how to exploit them. So for this, look more for in the future. So at this point, let's say that you find the way. So you find the service, you understand how it works, you understand how it is vulnerable, and through the vulnerability, you get code execution within the system. So at this point, you do have a foothold, you are able to execute code on the remote server. But the point is that you executed the code as a low or medium user, so with low or medium privilege level. And now you want to become administrator, you want to raise your privilege level, you want to perform privilege escalation. So assuming you have an interactive shell on the system, a way to execute commands on the system and to read the output essentially. So what should you do to obtain root privileges? Well, you start once again with enumeration. So enumeration is always the key because the path to root is gonna come out of the information you gather from the machine. This is why you gotta enumerate everything. And if you notice here, enumeration, the word enumerate happens a lot. You can see it a lot because it's extremely important actually. The specific techniques themselves are only a small portion of the work. Most of the work will go through enumeration in order to understand what is configured, how it is configured, and how it can be attacked. So the first thing you want to enumerate is users, groups, and privileges, because this is one of the most critical things. You want to ask yourself, what kind of privileges do I have? This is the thing you start with. For example, if you already have the same personate privilege, you can already attempt a privilege escalation with the sprint puffer, with the god potato, with other exploits that abuse that privilege. And so maybe you become already root and it's actually easy. If you have the same backup privilege, you can try to get a copy of the SAM and system files. You can extract the NTLM hashes of all the users. Maybe you can crack some of them. So that could be another way. So start with what you can already do and start also to understand the relationships that appear within the system. So what kind of users are in what kind of groups? Because sometimes you don't become the user administrator, but you become another user which belongs to the administrator group. So sometimes you don't need to become the user administrator, just need to understand what are the users that have special privileges. So that's the first thing. Then you want to enumerate install applications. Why? Because typically, if you're looking, for example, for known vulnerabilities, they will appear, they will happen essentially on already installed application. And typically, maybe you have an old application that is vulnerable and someone years ago publish a CV on that application and it has not been fixed. This happens a lot. So what you want to do is, okay, let's enumerate what is installed on my machine. And if there are things old or things that are vulnerable, then I can try to check if I can exploit the vulnerability. So another thing that is going to be useful is to enumerate for files in accessible directories. So once again, based on the user, based on the data that you can access with the user, you got the foothold, you want to enumerate the semi-system file if you can. You want to enumerate the PowerShell history files, the environment files, the environment variables, and also the configuration files for the application that are installed in the system. You want to enumerate for backups, for databases, maybe of password managers, things of the sort. And in this context, the cheat sheet, of course, is very useful because we have the search recursively command. For example, search all the files that have this extension, which is the KeePass extension, which is a password manager. So maybe you obtain the KeePass file, then you obtain the password from somewhere else, and then you have access to all the credentials of that user. So that's the idea. Enumerate files in accessible directories and start to gain a mental picture of, okay, what kind of users are we dealing with? What kind of application does he use? Does he or she use? What kind of data does he or she processes and stores? So that's the idea. Then of course you want to enumerate the store credential because it's extremely easy to do. I showed the commands previously and in the video on store credential and the credential vault. You want to enumerate for services. Once again, this is also linked to the install application because sometimes, most of the time, when we install one application, different services are actually installed and configured, and maybe they are misconfigured, so they could contain vulnerability. So once again, you want to check for known vulnerability, you want to check for services that have weakly been configured with weak service permission, you want to check for unquoted service path, for potential for DLL hijacking. I've already showed how to do all these techniques, so services are really key. You want to check for the always install elevated configuration, and to be honest, maybe you can just check it before even going through the services because it's a simple check to do. And if you have this option on, essentially, you are good to elevate your privileges, so it's an easy way to get to root. Now, if your user already belongs to a privilege group, however, you got a shell with a low integrity level, then to actually get access to all those high privileges, you need to do a UAC bypass. So once again, you can check the UAC level, you can try to bypass it with different ways depending on the level. So this is another thing to do. If you are already running as administrator, you still want to do something because you still want, for example, to run Mimikatz as an easy way to dump the LSAS process and get the NTLM hashes. So even if you are running as administrator, running Mimikatz can be extremely useful because you can obtain hashes for different users in different machines. And in the Active Directory series, we will of course do more of this because in Active Directory you have many machines. So once you obtain admin in one machine, you are not done. You want to pivot and obtain admin in the others until you obtain essentially the domain admin role, so the one who controls the Active Directory domain. For example, if you need to obtain the NTLM hash of your current user, what you can do is you can run responder to leak your net NTLM hash, and from that maybe you can try to crack your own hash. Then you can enumerate the scheduled task. You can try to enumerate if you can access the registry path that could allow you to, for example, do DLL hijacking or to deal with services as I showed in the video. But in general, I would say this the scheduled task enumeration is hard. It's not really easy to do because sometimes you do not see the task themselves, so it's really hard to enumerate. And for the critical registry path, sometimes you just don't have the permissions. So I will put this down in the list. Of course, if the antivirus is active, you want to bypass the AMSI. You want to make sure that you bypass also the tracing of the events, which is another system called ETW that essentially traces events in Windows. You want to execute software that is properly defended against antiviruses. Now, for example, in OSCP, you don't have an antivirus on, so you can simply bypass this. If you do have an antivirus on, AMSI bypass is not enough. So here I'm just going to say it is not enough. It's just what we cover in the course, but it's not enough at all. You need much more methods to protect the code you run essentially. So The idea is start with enumerating users, group and privileges, move into install application and then into files, enumerate low-hanging fruit, so things that can allow easily to obtain root. For example, I have a user that belongs to administrator, but I have a low integrity level. However, there's no UAC configured, so I can just bypass it easily. So that's a typical low-hanging fruit. Always check for non-vulnerabilities first. So you enumerate the application, you notice a weird name that is not Microsoft, that is not developed by Microsoft, check immediately the version. Check the configuration file, try to find the passwords like that essentially, and check for weird files in general. And that's it with respect to the basic approach. So of course, as I said, this is not 100% comprehensive of every possible scenario. However, it is a very strong foundational knowledge that will always help you regardless of the machine you're dealing with. Because, of course, one thing that here I did not put is use enumeration scripts. But to be honest, after all, enumeration scripts check these things and some more. If the machine is not too hard, probably with these things you will be good to go. Of course, if the machine is hard, it's made to be hard to obtain privilege escalation, maybe you might want to use more enumeration scripts. For basic machine, this is already a lot, and you should have it. At least all of these things you should know how to do it. And so essentially we are done with this video and therefore with the series. I hope it was useful, and I hope you will find useful both the cheat sheet and the methodology. Please let me know if you think I missed something. It would be interesting maybe to integrate it later on, not in the series, but maybe in the GitHub repository or with future videos, maybe specific technique that I forgot to mention. And so this is it. I'm gonna leave you now. I hope the video was enjoyable. I hope the entire series was useful and enjoyable. If it was so, leave some feedback, subscribe to the channel, share this video with like-minded people to help me grow, and to the next series and to the next video.